I'm going to take just a moment to give an infomercial for the National Association of Scholars. Most of you are only familiar with it from this event. We're an organization that was founded in 1987, and our purpose in being called into existence initially was to summon faculty members from around the country to take some kind of stand against then the new phenomena of political correctness on campus, the rising tide of politicization of the curriculum and academic appointments being made on non-academic bases. The theory behind the creation of NAS was that all it would take would be a summons to the conscience of the academics, and this foolishness would just vanish. That was a serious miscalculation. It turned out that there were thousands of faculty members who, like us, thought that there was a problem and that that was the answer, but thousands against the approximately 1.6 million people who work in higher education, either as full-time or part-time professors, wasn't really enough to make a difference. Nonetheless, we soldiered on, and now 26 some years later, the National Association of Scholars is still a vibrant organization. We're a membership group. A few years ago, we opened our membership to non-academics, having found that there is a greater passion for the restoration of Western civilization, of real academic freedom, of intellectual inquiry outside the academy than there often is within the academy. So a membership in the National Association of Scholars is $50 a year. And one of the benefits of that is a subscription to our quarterly journal, Academic Questions, which is, I must say, quite a good journal. We operate in the form of holding conferences, sometimes statewide, sometimes national. We maintain a website, and we do research publications. The report, the 400-page report, What Does Bowdoin Teach?, was in that vein, although it was by far the most ambitious such undertaking we've ever done. Last year we also produced, for comparison's sake, a report titled Recasting History, which was an analysis of the freshman history offerings at the University of Texas, Austin, and Texas A&M, where we found that about 78% of the courses were race, class, and gender, and there were whole areas of history like diplomatic history, intellectual history, military history that were utterly vanished and nowhere present at all. We did another report titled Beach Books, which was about what's happened at colleges when they discover that their freshmen have literally nothing in common. They've read no single book that the professor can trust every student knows. Forget about Achilles' heel, they don't know what Moby Dick is. Of course, a sensible response to that absence would be a creation of a core curriculum, at least some set of courses that all the students take so that they have something in common. But that would be a daunting prospect for many colleges that view student autonomy as a kind of idol. You can't tell students what to do. So the fallback position for that is the creation of something called a common book program. Every incoming freshman is asked to read before arriving on campus some work of literature which will then be discussed in the fall semester. There are about 315 or so colleges and universities that have adopted this approach. We went out and found out what all the books were and why they're being taught, and there were some remarkable findings there too. For example, we found that of the 315 colleges, only 4 of them assigned a book published before 1990. Apparently there were no books published before 1990. Most of them were books published in the last 10 years, and most of them were by living authors. Most of them, of course, dealt with race, class, and gender themes. Most of them, I'm sad to say, were really written at the junior high school level. So when colleges make a real assessment of the preparation of their students for a college curriculum, they rapidly dumb things down. They just assume that anything as tough as, say, a dialogue by Plato or a play by Shakespeare would be way over the heads of their students. Anyway, so we do this Beach Books report every year. We do various studies. We did one on the University of California, 2 years ago, another one on the Vanishing West, which was about the disappearance from 1964 to 2010 of Western civilization survey courses, which in 1964 were virtually universal. By 2010, we found one of them left in the country. After we published the report, the university that had that quickly took it away, so it's now down to 0. We do these kinds of studies in a very close to the ground empirical way. We want to know what the facts are, and we see part of our mission is to bring the spirit of scholarship to the cultural debates over the university. So we're not really looking for scandals to expose. We're not attacking individuals. We sometimes will name names, but that's when we're quoting people who have interesting things to say. So we're not the organization that's going to expose the next Ward Churchill or something like that, but we are the organization that is going to find the next Bowdoin. That is a college or university that has ample resources to fully realize the vision of what it wants to be. In the case of Bowdoin, the great advantage of studying this college is that it's wealthy enough to be free to realize what it wants to be. Bowdoin isn't choosing the courses, its faculty, any aspect of the curriculum based on necessity. It's making a deliberative choice. It's a well thought through choice in the sense that when Bowdoin adds a course to its curriculum or takes one out, it goes through a process of many layers of committee and approval by deans and by the college president. None of this stuff is accidental. There is no kind of we didn't know about it excuse at Bowdoin. Bowdoin does what Bowdoin does because it's thought about it and decided that that's the right decision. Now, from my point of view, that makes it an ideal place to study these problems. We're talking about the problem of how a college shapes its students. It does that mainly through the curriculum, but there's also something that I can't better describe than campus culture, the values that get promoted from the pulpit of the college president, the values that get expressed in the student activities that are encouraged or discouraged, those that are tolerated, those that are disdained. That sort of thing seeps into one's life. Now, I imagine that just about everybody in this room has had a college education. By the time you're my age, the details of that college education may long since have vanished, but there's some kind of imprint. And in me, the imprint is from Haverford College, another small college, a lot like Bowdoin in a lot of ways. It's shaped my life. And it's shaped my life for good in some ways, for mischief in some other ways. And there are things I regret not having studied, but I also know that I rebounded from the things I didn't study then by wanting to learn them later. So I don't take it that what happens or doesn't happen in a Bowdoin curriculum is the be-all and end-all of the lives of the graduates of the college. We go on to long lives. We take interest in new things. We learn a lot from each other and from the books that we will subsequently read. That's all to the good, but despite that good, there still is this residue of what did you really learn? How did college shape you? And that's the kind of question the National Association of Scholars wrestles with. We're a liberal arts-oriented organization. Not to say we aren't interested in more specialized areas, we are, but the core of what we do is looking at what happens in an undergraduate education to make students into better people. And by better people, we mean, at least in part, citizens of this country, people able to take advantage of the rich legacy that becomes available through college, and primarily through college, and to learn that well enough to go on to become good parents, good contributors to society, to take possession of a legacy and pass it on to another generation. That's what we would really like to see happen in college. Now, most of you, I think, were here for this morning's sessions, but not all of you, and I feel some obligation to give a little bit more context to this without repeating my 20-minute speech. So I'm going to try a highlights reel of World Conquest, as I titled my opening remarks. It goes something like this, that most people, given a choice, would prefer to be a world citizen than the subject of a dictator or a denizen of a third world slum. But would you want to be a world citizen if it meant forfeiting your rights as an American citizen. I think the answer for most of us would be no, but I do note there are exceptions to that. The exceptions I mentioned this morning are, for example, Bradley Manning and his compatriot now Edward Snowden, people who essentially betrayed the United States. I bring them up not because Bowdoin extols them as citizens of the world, but because they've attracted large followings that precisely call them citizens of the world. You can check that out for yourself. Now, the term citizen of the world is nothing new. In 4th century BC Athens, there was a man of disgusting personal habits named Diogenes, who christened himself as a citizen of the world. He was an exile from another Greek city. He's become known in popular thought as that philosopher who wandered the world with a lantern looking for an honest man. But he was our first citizen of the world, and he gave the term something that stuck with it for at least 2,000 years. The sense that a citizen of the world is a shifty person, someone who has put himself outside the rule of law, who disdains culture, who sees himself in a certain sense as superior to the mores of his time. He claims a kind of universality about his being in the world, but at the same time, his fellow citizens look on him as somebody they can't trust, and for good reason. Now, citizen of the world was used in this sort of pejorative fashion for a long, long time. If you remember Dickens' novel, Little Dorrit, there is a villainous character in it. The story begins and he's in prison for suspicion of having murdered his wife, which indeed he did. Later on, he emerges as a blackmailer and thief. Every time Dickens introduces this character, he has him puffing himself up and saying, I am a citizen of the world. Yes, he's a citizen of the world and a wife killer. Not every citizen of the world has such dubious backgrounds. I gave you Gary Davis, who recently died in Burlington, Vermont at the age of 91. Mr. Davis renounced his American citizenship in 1948 and then spent the subsequent years being bounced from one country to another, frequently trying to get himself arrested on petty theft charges so that he could stay in jail as opposed to being deported. He made his living by selling passports, identity cards, birth and marriage certificates that identify the holder as a citizen of the world. And by the time of his death, he'd sold these to 950,000 people. So there really are citizens of the world, but few of them, like Mr. Davis, gave up their U.S. citizenship to achieve it. He, by the way, was a failed Broadway actor. He'd been an understudy of Danny Kaye in a Broadway musical before he hit on the genial idea of becoming a world citizen. Now, I make a little bit light of this idea of world citizenship because I think there is a kind of velity to it, an insouciance, a lightness of being, that when someone adopts this term, they're not seriously thinking through what the consequences of it might be. What do I give up if I say I'm this? Implicitly, you're giving up a lot. You're giving up the rights and duties of American citizenship. You're giving up the Bill of Rights. There is no Bill of Rights for world citizens. The fundamental unseriousness of it seems to me to be illustrated in a few things, like there are no passports for world citizens. The absence of these sort of insignia of being a citizen of a particular place, I think can be connected to other aspects of transnationalism, our pretenses at international law that when push comes to shove don't mean very much. UN Security Council resolutions don't change the world. Usually they are, as I cited the one that just passed last week, 2133, that encourages nations that pay ransom to terrorists not to support terrorists. You can figure that out on your own. There is nonetheless something, I think, sort of serious about the idea not of world citizenship, but of world conquest, in that we expect students to come into command of bodies of material that are at least initially, probably beyond them. I mentioned Plato, Shakespeare, but think of the hard sciences, particle physics, cell biology. To conquer these things doesn't require armies or superweapons, but it requires immense patience, intellectual openness, reason, concentration, this dedication to finding the truth. And it's not an easy path. One can read and not understand. You can read all the way through Plato or all the way through Shakespeare and come away from that with the barest knowledge of what these things really have to say. When do these books begin to speak to you? Not when you conquer them, but when you allow them to conquer you. And that seems to me to be the kind of world conquest that a liberal arts education ought to be promoting. Now, I've mentioned, and it's been mentioned repeatedly, this report on what does Bowdoin teach. President Mills was dismissive of the report within a few days of its publication, but he didn't dismiss all of it. He said in his formal reply that yes, Bowdoin does support global citizenship. This is what he wrote. We are also committed to preparing our students to become global citizens in a global economy and for careers that call for critical thinking, judgment, and principled leadership. Well, I'm all for reason, critical thinking, judgment, principled leadership. I do think it's a good thing that students learn to be prepared to deal in the global economy, because that's the kind of economy we have. All of this sounds wholesome to me, but I think it's rather superficial. Students are not really being prepared for a global economy with the profusion of this idea of global citizenship. I think it's a kind of, as I called it this morning, a fog bank that has drifted in from the Atlantic, obscuring the deficiencies of the Bowdoin curriculum. Among the things that it obscures is the need to understand something about their own nation. Most of the Bowdoin students, not all of them, are American citizens, but history majors at Bowdoin are not required to take a single course in American history. English majors at Bowdoin are not required to take, as of this fall, any courses in American literature. Now, it's easy to say, well, you don't have to require something the students are going to do anyway, and to some extent that's true, but there is a sort of statement of priorities here as well. Bowdoin history students are required to take quite a bit of third world history. Bowdoin students are required to take literature from around the world, but not American. It says something. Exactly what it says, maybe that's an open topic. What applies to the majors in these subjects applies to all the other students at Bowdoin. No one is required to take these sorts of courses. Now, I don't mean to brush aside the good things that Bowdoin does. It has a first-rate government department that teaches critical courses in this area, and the history and English departments certainly teach courses in American history and American literature. The issue here is that these are things that are offered, as opposed to what happens with the global citizenship idea. It's not simply offered, it's unavoidable. Two of Bowdoin's only distribution requirements deal with global citizenship. One's called Exploring Social Differences, the other's called International Perspectives. Every student has to take at least one course in both of those areas. There is no similar requirement that touches on American founding, commonalities, culture of America. It's a subject that doesn't exist at Bowdoin in the same way that these claims for diversity, multiculturalism, and world citizenship do. I say a succinct way of putting this is that Bowdoin rejects the idea of American exceptionalism, that Americans' freedom, self-government, and pursuit of justice are in some way distinct. President Mills has repeatedly coined a term that he uses called Bowdoin exceptionalism, which places the distinctive approach towards the liberal arts that Bowdoin has a kind of above America. This is a mind-opening approach that puts students, potential graduates, in the position of a kind of privileged view down on what mere America has to offer. We had some really good papers this morning that dealt with the way in which this Bowdoin exceptionalism, I'm calling it, plays with post-nationalism or transnationalism, these larger currents in American higher education and in our policy circles that keep demoting the idea of anything distinctively important about American identity in favor of claims that cross-cut that. Global citizenship, in my view, is something that's just sort of fading away into thin air. There isn't much there when you go looking for it. In speaking of it as something that lacks much intellectual substance, I don't want to dismiss the fact that there are very substantial thinkers over the years that have given credit to it. I'm thinking of people like Karl Marx, but then H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, and the person of the moment, who the greatest current intellectual supporter of the idea of global citizenship is the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. Her work, particularly her book Cultivating Humanity, has been cited by President Mills as sort of the foundation of where he's coming from on this. And I would say that that's a book worth knowing if you take this subject seriously. There's a kind of world conquest implicit in all of higher education. That's the decision that every student has to make to relinquish easy answers, to put aside the cliches, and really make that head-on attempt to become the owner of this dauntingly vast world of ideas, concepts, knowledge that make up an educated person. Every student who attempts it is doomed to fail. We all fail. Herb London once lived in Western civilization, but he didn't own Western civilization. It was always vaster than he could be, and it's vaster than any of us or all of us together can be. But it has a richness, and it has an order to it that you can know, and you can become familiar with it, and beyond familiarity, enriched by it. That seems to me to be implicit in a phrase, a lovely phrase, to be at home in all lands and ages, which is the opening line of the offer of the college by former president of Bowdoin, William DeWitt Hyde, in 1906. That phrase, to be at home in all lands and ages, might sound a bit like global citizenship, but it's really a very American ambition. It flows from our core beliefs in universal rights, in common aspirations, in human dignity, and it flows from the assumption that most of the differences that we encounter are no more than skin deep. We have some obligation to go beyond what's skin deep, to understand something deeper. That doesn't make us world citizens. It makes us human. An American is someone who can think of Homer and Dante and other great writers not as locked away in antiquity and requiring some immense struggle to get to, but as countrymen of sorts, not that different from Melville or Twain, two of my favorite writers. We're a nation that assimilates. We assimilate not just people, but ideas, and we believe that deep down that we're all in this together. I cited Ben Franklin's adage in encouraging the colonies to unite against Britain, which was join or die, and that other famous phrase, out of many one, which is our national motto. Those speak to that American sense of let's join and not make a fetish out of our differences, which are many and easy to elevate. Now, there is a fight. Sometimes it's the culture wars. There are other ways of phrasing it. But there has been, over the last generation or so, an ardent attempt by the progressive left, maybe this is the transnational left, as John Fonte was distinguishing, that says that American liberal education was nothing but a kind of facile celebration of a mythical greatness, and it needs to be replaced by chopping that tree down to size, or maybe down to a stump, and then uprooting the stump. That when we celebrate America, we're just feeding the beast that America is going to go out and tyrannize the rest of the world, and that neo-colonialism and imperialism are in our blood, And what feeds the corpuscles of that blood is a liberal education in the old sense. It was a nasty thing that led students into their desire to be part of the machine. So we're going to put an end to that, says the progressive left. We're going to make sure that students understand every bit what a nasty country this was from the moment the Puritans started to slaughter the Narragansett Indians, and on to this day. The Howard Zinn we had referred to a moment ago with his probably most popular history book in the country right now, The People's History of the United States, tells this tale of woe, of this, what a nasty, downright awful bunch of people we are. And if you want to know American history, it begins and ends with understanding our depravity. Now, there's a kind of Puritanism in that, too. No insult to the Puritans, of which I'm one. But the notion here being that something in American higher education has turned into a contest, a fight. It's a lopsided fight, for sure, as Casey Johnson was showing us in the history curricula today, trying to find any purchase at all for the bits of pieces that might deal with how America became a strong, powerful, prosperous, and free country has been hugely displaced by the identity narratives, the apotheosis of every social difference into a command of the moment that says diversity matters far more than commonality. Well, I said something else that is a bit insulting to the Bowdoin curriculum. I'm going to repeat it and just let it sit there. I think that what we've seen overall in American higher education is that the pyramids of knowledge, the sense that there are some subjects that you have to learn before others that are more fundamental, that provide the base for more advanced learning, those pyramids of knowledge with their sturdy bases have been replaced. At Bowdoin, we documented the hell out of that, as in the disappearance of survey courses, the attenuation of introductory courses, and this huge proliferation over the last 50 years of what I call topics courses that have thin prerequisites, are highly specialized, don't really begin anywhere, don't end anywhere. They're just sort of zeroing in on some topic that is calculated to be appealing to students. That now dominates Bowdoin's curriculum and many other colleges. And they appear to me to be more like clouds of curricular confetti. They don't hang together. There's no story. They're just up in the air. To the extent they have any coherence at all, it's that the pieces of confetti all resemble each other. They deal with race, class, gender, sometimes sexual preference. They have about them the quality of a shared depiction of the West in general and America in particular as a uniquely oppressive place where the weak take it on the chin from the strong. The powerful are always sticking it to you. And that's the story that you're going to get out of most college humanities and social sciences curricula today. Instead of an ambition to know the whole world and to know it as it is, we now have an ambition to supervise the world. That's really the message that gets formed here. We want to supervise the world and make it conform to the things that we think we already know. Those campus doctrines, there's three that seem to me to cover most of the territory. One is the multiculturalists, who are eager to assert the priority of identity groups over national communities. The second is a word I made up, but I've been using it long enough that it's beginning to catch on, hooray. The sustainatopians, eager to impose their ideas about how electricity should be generated and what should not be done with the world's resources, supervised. Free choices get sacrificed. And finally, the social justice vigilantes who are eager to impose their versions of political correctness on everyone else. That's the humanities curriculum today. The benign-sounding idea of global citizenship is really a recipe for a kind of control over the world. And maybe control is too strong a word. I like that distinction that John Fonte drew between government and governance. Governance is a lot softer and fuzzier and harder to get your hands around. Global citizenship wants world governance. it usually wants it through a huge profusion of bureaucracy. And by bureaucracy, I probably don't have to say much to invoke my own disdain for it, but we're talking about people that you never elected, that your taxes pay, and who have the ability to issue edicts from various government agencies, both at the state and federal level, but if the governance movement gets its way, by the international level, by courts and bodies that you never saw or heard of, but suddenly have the power to control very fine details of your life. I think that's where this leads. I don't think that Bowdoin students or students exposed to this think it through in that way. The enticing idea of becoming a bureaucrat probably isn't on the career path agenda for very many students. But if you take this kind of language seriously, if you take these concepts seriously, and you realize that they operate in a near total absence of discussion of the alternatives or any attempt to think through critically of what the flaws of these are, it's pretty much where they lead. It leads to a willingness to sacrifice the hard-fought, hard-won freedoms of this society for somebody else telling us what to do. I don't much like that, but my liking it is neither here nor there. Question is that the kind of education that we want to give to the next generation, and what are we foregoing if that's the education that we provide?